My name is Bill Croft, and I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of New Mexico in the United States. Well, it's a process by which language variation comes about and how some variants are selected and then become conventions of the speech community. And then with the diversification or the diversification of speech communities, you also get the diversification of the languages that are spoken by those communities. And that leads to the kind of massive language diversity that we have in the world today, though of course much of that is being lost because of recent social and political factors leading to the death of many languages. I think of language evolution as involving processes of language change and developing a kind of framework for understanding language change, bringing into account theories of evolution from other domains like biology. Some other people use the term language evolution to think of the evolutionary origin of the language capacity, and that involves some different questions because there you have a more significant role of the co-evolution of presumably biologically based human cognitive and social behavioral properties, as well as the evolution of actual linguistic forms that are used in communication. So that's how I see the difference. But there is a lot of difference of opinion among linguists about how to frame that question. Well, a lingueme is basically everything that I'm saying at this very moment. It's linguistic structures that occur in utterances. So every time I speak, I am replicating, reproducing sounds, words, and constructions that I've used in the past, that I've heard in the past, and that I heard in the process of learning my language. So the lingueme is actually very much a unit that is a real thing that's actually spoken at any given time. So I've now, in answering your question, have reproduced a whole bunch of sounds, words, and constructions. So I've created a bunch of linguemes that didn't exist before. Then when you respond to me, you're going to create some more. Well, I think the problem there is that the nature of these units are extremely complex, and they have complex structures. These things that we think of as larger scale units really function as larger scale entities function as single units in replication processes like whole grammatical constructions or idioms. So I think by saying there are no units of evolution because you have this high degree of complexity in the organization of these units and the process of replication that they are engaged in, going to that and saying there are no units is like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There are lots of different kinds of units, and they're interlocking, interconnected, made parts of each other in a lot of complicated, interesting ways. And the striking thing about it is you have a remarkable degree of parallelism between how that is true in biology and in language. That's one of the kind of interesting and surprising things that really calls for an explanation. Another thing that I'm doing that is a little different from many linguists is using mathematical modeling to try to address some linguistic problems, because linguists are traditionally very empirically oriented, collecting large amounts of data and finding ways to analyze them. But sometimes you're dealing with a complex system like language use in a society, and it's so complex that you cannot really collect all the data, discrete pieces of data about individuals' behavior. And so when you're talking about a whole population like a speech community, sometimes you need to use modeling in order to test some hypotheses, because you simply cannot collect all the data in such detail that would be necessary to confirm or disconfirm these hypotheses. Well, in the case of language, I should really speak about language. I mean, I know there are similar things in biology, but I'm not the expert. So with respect to language, I think what matters is ultimately languages as collections of these linguemes are spoken by speech communities. So what you're looking at when you talk about reticulation or contact effects or phylogenies to begin with is you're talking about what happens to speech communities. So a phylogeny should reflect some degree of splitting, isolation of speech communities over time. And I think it is true that happens, but equally true in language, and I know also in biology, but in language there's always some degree of language contact between communities that have separated and have been separated for any length of time. And it has linguistic effects which we can observe. Some linguemes basically get transmitted across speech communities. And that does cause problems for reconstructing phylogenies. And so I think one solution is, instead of just thinking of these contact effects as noise in constructing a phylogeny of languages, is you should think of them as interesting data in their own right to try to understand how do these processes take place, what kind of linguistic effects do they have, what are the social causes of these linguistic effects. And that will actually also help us answer the question of how can we separate the facts of contact from the facts of the splitting of societies, the fission of societies and their radiation or spread through the world in terms of migration, and thus allow us to be able to find the trees as well as understand the contact relations between separate branches in those trees. But once again, I would say taking a position that there are no trees is kind of, again, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because there's certainly, we have well-established and documented evidence of societies splitting up and diverging and dispersing themselves, and then their language changing as a consequence.